Okay. Hi everyone. It's Katrina. I don't have an intro, which is unfortunate because I'm like mad awkward. Um, so we're just gonna jump in. I have always loved when authors do like pre-release thoughts or like release day thoughts. I always want to do that, but honestly, I normally have no thoughts. Like when a book comes out, I'm normally just moving on with my day or like at work. Like I'm honestly not really thinking as much about it as I could be or should be. But for this book and this series slash world, I want to do it. Mostly because I wanted to sort of talk through some of the things that like were in my mind, in my brain, and heart as I was working on not just this book called A Flicker to a Flame, but like the world to come. Yeah. So really it all starts with the bat. It doesn't. But the bat is necessary. So when I came back from California for a con, I was really thinking about like what was next on my schedule. I had a very firm plan that has like since I've blown apart. Um, and part of blowing apart that plan was one night I was coming out of the bathroom after doing my skincare and getting ready for bed. And I thought my lights were flickering in my bedroom. I walked to the doorway and saw my cat on my bed and then saw a bat flying around the light fixture in my bedroom. And I was like, what the fuck? And my cat was looking at the bat like, what the fuck? And so then we all were looking at each other like, what the fuck? And it took a minute, but then my brain rebooted. I opened the patio door and the bat flew off into the night to do whatever it had to do. No judgment. And I thought, what a strange story. What a fluke. Never have to think about that again. I'll tell people this the next day. It'll be funny. But then the next night, same thing. Coming out of the bathroom, there's a bat flying up my stairwell. And I freak out. But again, eventually, I open the patio door and it flies off into the night. After the third time, where I fell asleep in my bedroom, lights all on, cat snuggled up next to me, and then like felt the wind like brushing against my face and saw a bat flying around my bedroom again, I was like, something must be done. We must end this species. We cannot. Bats are federally protected. And so that was like the beginning of like a few weeks of just absolute ridiculousness where I tried to make myself nocturnal because I didn't want my cat, especially to like try and attack the bat and then get rabies, and then I'm losing 2 cats in a year. Like I just couldn't handle that. I didn't want to get rabies also as well. But also I didn't want a bat living in my home. Like I totally think they should be allowed to live, but I didn't have to be my home. So it took forever for me to get like a technician out here to like check my attic, no bats, and also just in general to like shore up my house and any access points that bat might have been using to get in here. In the midst of that, I did leave for a bit to go on a trip to a cabin in the central Ohio for my birthday to like celebrate alone. And on the way there, I was listening to Dracula, which one is not a book I like anymore. It's not that good. The movie adaptations are great though. And two, I was like thinking about some of the stuff that I had wanted to work on. And I had a really big brain like moment where I realized that all of these paranormal stories that I had in my head were all connected. So rest in peace, but thank you, Bat. And that is how we end up here. And so I want to talk to you about how we end up with a book called A Flicker to a Flame and a new series called The Mosley Coven, which is the beginning of a larger Black paranormal world. Yes. Okay, so I've like been a fan of like science fiction and fantasy and paranormal like since I was a kid. I was a very specific kind of like Anne Rice goth, which whatever. And I love like N.K. Jemisin. I love paranormal romance and science fiction and fantasy, romantasy, whatever they're calling it now. And I have always wondered and thought about like what would a paranormal book look like if I wrote it. And I've written like a little bit of light paranormal, The Tenant, about a haunted house and a ghost from the 1930s. And last year I published in When You Leave Me about a woman experiencing grief over the death of her husband around New Year's. And in both of those cases, like I liked writing paranormal, but it didn't feel like I had to like really think too hard about specifically the world building, which is the thing that beat my ass for this series that I'm launching now. But it is also the big brain, like bat induced, like part of this series that I actually love. Most days. Some days I did not love it. But for this video, I wanted to sort of talk you through some of the questions I asked myself as I was like constructing these books and this world, and then also sort of tell you a little bit about A Flicker to a Flame and what's coming next. Okay, so first of all, like again, as a long-term like fantasy and paranormal reader, again, as also someone who was like a huge like Anne Rice fan, I have really always believed in the idea of like fated mates, like we call it in romance, or just soulmates, like we would call it in sort of outside of like romance spaces. But because I was a morbid like child who thought a lot about death and grief, I also have always wondered what would it be like if your soulmate or your fated mate died before you got the chance to meet them. And I think that particular thought comes from a few different disparate but I think maybe understandable places. So one of them is I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the wake of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and so I have known throughout my life like a lot of people and have heard a lot of stories about people who lost loved ones, whether they were romantic partners, friends, just community members, to the epidemic. And I thought a lot as a kid about how just horrible that would have been for people to survive their loved ones in that way, especially in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and feeling like it was in some respects like a matter of chance. The other kind of related thing is when I was like sort of coming of age as like a young adult, so like in my late teens, 20s, there was a lot of conversation relative to dating about the numbers of Black men in particular who had either been incarcerated or had been killed in racist violence. And it sort of kind of spurred this question in me that I have sort of sat with for 20 or so years now, where I've thought about, like, if I believe in soulmates, which I do, what happens when your soulmate has been taken out of society, like with those who are incarcerated, or they have passed, like those who have been killed, not necessarily only by racist violence, but that was the context that I was thinking about it in. And then, not in a romantic sense, but if you have read my blog post on grief, I talk about how I was raised in a family sort of reeling from grief. In particular, like my grandmother passed just a few months before I was born, but I actually had an uncle. My mother has one brother, and he passed before my older brother was born. And my mother named me and my middle name in remembrance of both her mother and her older brother. And I have grown up like with my grandmother with lots of stories about my uncle, but I never knew him. And so I've thought a lot about in my life what it is like to love someone you have never actually known, because you did not like exist in the world at the same time. And especially when it comes to like families, I am obsessed with like Black family histories. I think that's a thing that lots of people actually might feel, even if they might not necessarily name it in that way. So that's a question I've always had for fantasy and paranormal romances. Like, what happens if you and your fated mate miss one another because of death? I have notes, so I'm looking down at my notes. So then the second is a question I've had really since I was like a teenager, and I was reading, just like binge reading Anne Rice, who wrote about a lot of immortals. I never could really square with the idea of how do you have someone who's lived for 100 years, 200 years, and has lived through so many atrocities in human history. I especially was thinking about slavery, and Anne Rice sort of has like an answer for that in her books, which is that Louis, my favorite character in that series, was a slave owner, right? And I think that that's yikes. But in terms of my own work, sort of thinking about like, how do you deal with a Black immortal in that space? How do they deal with a world that denigrates people who look like them, immortal or not, and it treats them in very callous ways. And while I'm not dealing with immortals in A Flicker to a Flame, I'm absolutely dealing with immortals in a later book. So we'll talk about that when we get there. And then, okay, the next question is a thing I have thought about a lot as someone who, I'm not a historian of slavery, but I was trained by a lot of historians who either dealt with enslavement itself or the period of slavery. And I also teach about slavery a lot. And it is a thing I think about in fantasy. It's a question I've asked, and it's a question that a few authors have attempted to pose, like what would happen if enslaved people had magical powers. And well, this is not about A Flicker to a Flame. There is a prequel short story that begins to answer that question, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit. But for me, especially, like, I love Black history. I love thinking about like historical elements to actually a lot of my books, like more than I think I realized. And so I really wanted to have the space to think about what it could look like to begin a story about generations of a magical family that begins in slavery. And then my last question is essentially a question I think I've been asking and answering for most of my career, whether I realize it or not. But what would happen if some of these tropes that I'm interested in and some of, or a lot of the history that I know and I am studying and teaching, what would happen when they met? What would happen when they met? I don't know how to edit, so we're getting all my like random flubs. So those I think are like the 3 or the 4 most like important questions for me, not just with this series of witch books, but in the larger world. So let's talk about these actually 2 releases. So first, if you have not already read it, there is a prequel short story called The Night Gate, which is the beginning of this magical family. And when I posed the question, what would happen if enslaved people had powers, I had to accept a couple things to be true. 1, this is a magical world. And 2, potentially white people, in my stories, they do have powers. And so how does slavery figure into that? And what would happen if enslaved people had enough power to free themselves? And I am a historian who has really loved, for lots of reasons, sort of thinking about and reading about and then teaching about slave rebellions, slave resistance, and slave revolutions. I think it is so important to sort of talk about and recover the history of slave resistance for so many reasons. And for me, the question seemed really obvious. If enslaved people could have had the power, they would have freed themselves. And so this family and this story begins with The Night Gate, which is a short story right before a really bloody slave rebellion, slave revolution that not only sort of starts this family's history, but also starts the history of this magical town, which is very important. But today is the release day for A Flicker to a Flame. So about 2 years ago, I almost published a witch romance called Invocation. And I didn't publish it because honestly, I was burnt out and I just could not like finish it in time. I could not sort of think about it in enough time to publish it. And so I pulled it. And then I sat on it not really knowing what I was going to do with it. And then 2 years later, or however long later, there was a bat in my house. And I realized a whole bunch of things at once. And so now finally, I'm ready to release Invocation. We'll talk about it in a second. But to tell that story, I always knew it was a story of generations. The protagonist in Invocation and her family members, who are part of the sort of central novels of this series, are very much connected to the generation above them, their mothers, and also their uncle. And so A Flicker to a Flame is about Cato, who is the only son in a very powerful magical family in a town called Mossville that is created by the slave revolution. He is a very powerful witch, but he is a gay man who in this small magical town only has so many romantic options. And so on this night, he and his sisters go out into the world looking to see something of the world beyond their gates. And he meets the love of his life, Xavier, who is having the worst day of his life. Please check the content warnings on this because I am delving into some of the things that I talked about relative to, in particular, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This book takes place in the 1980s, and that is for a reason. And so A Flicker to a Flame is about what happens when you send 3 magical siblings out into the world, and one of them, in this story, meets the love of their life. And I have to say that it has been a while since I've written an MM romance. I love writing MM romances. Many of you know that like most of my series are sort of mixed in terms of the sexuality and relationships. Not all, but most of them are. And it has been a while since I have been able to write an MM story. And I think my favorite thing about writing Black MM stories is getting to write Black men who are emotional and loving with one another as well as with the ones that they love. And so I hope that you enjoy this novella. I also hope that you are ready to enter this world with me, because now I get to tell you about what comes next. So A Flicker to a Flame is out now. If you're seeing this, it is available, but it releases on my website. There will be a link down below on October 17th, and then it releases to other retailers on October 31st. And then by the end of the year, sometime in December, date TBD, because what are dates? What is time? You'll finally get Invocation, which is the first novel in the Mosley Coven series, which is a multi-generational look at a powerful Southern Black witch family. And then I can tell you that what's coming up in 2025 will be, first of all, if you like the Mosleys, if you like the Mosley Coven, late next year, you'll get another novella with another sibling, and then a novel with another family member as well. In between now and then, you'll also get a book about polyamorous gods, which I have been waiting to write, and my assistant Kai has been bugging me to write since I wrote like the first third of the book and was like, I'll come back to it later. And I guess later is now. And there will also be a Dracula retelling, because I really want to write vampires. So yay. So this is an intro just to sort of tell you some things that I have been thinking about while I have been not really on the internet, certainly not talking on the internet, but also to give you a sneak peek of what's coming next. I really hope that you all will open your minds to this novella and this short story and the world that I'm building. I would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. And I'm also going to, I don't normally do this, but I'm also going to leave a couple of my favorite Black history texts that deal with some of the things that I was thinking about as I was writing the short story, the novella, and the novel, and also planning for what comes next. I think it's going to be a fun end of 2024 and an interesting 2025. Yeah. All right, bye.